Well, Lloyd, thank you so much for allowing me to come here, and great gratitude to the board of the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority. Let me just say that I consider Wyoming, as the governor has pointed out, but disinterested third party would also say that I believe your state is right at the pinnacle of doing things for coal, not just in the current environment, but for the future of coal. If you look at all the other states, frankly, in the Union, who had a lot of activity going on in this area, it's much less now than it was 10 years ago. And Wyoming is, in my mind, the only state that is persevered in this way. I like coming back here. Cheyenne, it's the West. I grew up in Idaho, grew up in a place called Blackfoot. If any of you know that, going down Interstate 15 between Idaho Falls and Pocatello, if you take a long yawn, you will miss Blackfoot going from Idaho Falls to Pocatello, but that's where I grew up. So I'm happy to be back out in this part of the world. And I want to take a little bit of time then to talk first about where I think we are with coal, particularly in the context of technology, and then spend a bit more time talking about some of the technology initiatives that at least we think are important for the future of coal, some of which is going on in your state even now. This is a quick picture of the membership of the Coal Utilization Research Council. 3 of the organizations from Wyoming, including the Authority, the University of Wyoming, and the Western Research Institute, are all members of our organization, so I thank you for that. Just a quick note that we were organized in 1997. Our only purpose in life is to support the development of coal-based technology, which includes carbon capture and sequestration. Let me start with just reminding us where we are in a day when there's too much talk about the demise of coal. We have a lot of coal, we continue to use a lot of coal. And even though you've seen some diminution in the last several years, it's still expected, even from the Energy Information Administration, that we're going to use anywhere from 32 to 38% of all the electricity generated between now and 2040 is going to come from coal. That doesn't mean that we haven't had really dramatic increases in the use of natural gas. All of that is expected to continue well into the future as well, a consequence of its abundance and its low cost. This chart from the National Energy Technology Laboratory, an arm of the Department of Energy, shows exactly what's going to happen. That hash line, red hash line, I hope you can see it, 2013, but about 130 gigawatts of new natural gas combined cycle, maybe 84 gigawatts of new combustion turbines fueled by coal. That's about 2.1 TCF of incremental natural gas use for electricity. This is from a 2012 baseline. As I said already, the reason for that is price and availability. I think the important thing to note here, while it doesn't include renewables, it does include coal, natural gas, and nuclear. And what you don't see on the right-hand side of that hash line is much coal. A little bit of coal because of projects that are already underway, but the reality of it is we're not looking at a lot of coal in the future. So that's one of my, what I call my Darth Vader walk into the doom and gloom of coal, but have heart because I'm going to get us out of that towards the end of this presentation. Let me make another point with respect to coal and the use of coal, not just the projections of what we're presumably not going to be building between now and 2040, that is no coal. The reasons for that, of course, have to do with a lot with the regulatory provisions that come from a lot of different ways that will impact coal and really impact coal before the 2020s. This is much too complicated, but it's just to give you an idea of all those regulations out there. Another in my perception at least, challenge to coal is that our coal fleet is getting old. By 2020, the average age of the coal fleet will be 42 years old, and NETL did a study here and also took a look at, well, of that existing coal fleet, because remember, we're not building new coal plants, of that existing coal fleet, about 50 to 54 gigawatts is going to retire within the next several years. If you take a look at that same spread of where those existing units are today, the gray hash lines there that you can hardly see, and then you start moving that hash line, because remember, we're not building new coal plants, and what you're really looking at in the next 26, 27 years is a fleet that's about 62 years old in age. And that same fleet, though, is expected to operate at about a 72% capacity factor in 2025, and that'll ramp up to about a 78% capacity factor in 2035. Now, what does this mean? Well, it means we got older units operating like baseload units harder than they actually have now. At least there's some question as to whether or not that can be done, but that is one of the challenges, seems to me, we're facing. Just to point out something as it relates to the West, for example, by 2025, of those units that are up there, there are only about 29 gigawatts of all of that that will be around 35 years of age or younger. And when you think about it, those are the units likely to be retrofittable. If you got something older than that, putting a lot of capital, additional capital on it to address things like CO2 capture is a little difficult to do, it seems to me. So you're not looking at a large quantity of the existing fleet that is going to be retrofitted. But importantly for the West, most of that fleet, that younger fleet, is out here. It's not in the Midwest, certainly not in Appalachia or the East. So one last thought about retirements. The pink, the orange, I think, and the blue are where the impact is going to happen with coal plant retirements. And this table is intended to give you a sense of what we're talking about. I said that the hazardous air pollutants, the so-called MATS rule, looks like it's going to cause the retirement of anywhere from 50 to 54 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity between now and 2020. The regulatory impact analysis that EPA has done, one of the analyses that they've done for purposes of the implementation of the 111D rule, suggests that as much as another 49 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity will retire if those rules are promulgated or promulgated in their current form. The bottom line here is that within the next 15 years, we may see 1/3 of the entire U.S. coal fleet retired. Now, what does that do to the coal producers, many of whom, the largest, are in Wyoming, in the Powder River Basin? If you just take a look at the market capitalization, this is an old slide, but I think it's relevant today. The big balls, if you will, the red, let's just take Peabody. In April of 2011, that was sort of the comparison of their market capitalization in April of 2011. In July of 2013, that was their market capitalization. Things aren't great out there for the coal-producing industry. Obviously, a very important point for those of you in this room who are concerned about coal production and its ability to keep producing in this state and really in the United States as a whole. I don't want to spend any time on this, but just to direct you to the right-hand side, lots of words there. Let me make 2 points here. First of all, don't assume that coal will remain a very vibrant option for the United States. If you look at some of the projections that are being made out there by the EIA and others, where it's a showing of less and less use of coal, at least new coal. And think about your kids and hearing that drumbeat of less and less, and maybe you don't need it at all. And to the extent that's the case, I think it's worrisome. I think it's also worrisome that we don't have the brigade of proponents of coal that this country needs. We need to have a lot more informed proponents of coal in the country, saying good things about coal. It's hard for the political community to do that, particularly if there's not the constituency to do it. So the Coal Utilization Council looks at about three things. That's how we tried to maintain and build our platforms. One is that we need to promote the benefits of coal. This, I think, applies to everybody in this room who's looking at how do we deal with making sure that coal stays in the mix and that we have a good case to make. There are many, many benefits to the use of the existing fleet itself. We need to identify the importance of new coal-based options and the importance of energy options in the country. You're going to hear a little bit more about that from Carl Bauer and others. And finally, let me just emphasize that we are not going to address global climate change, if you believe that's a problem, without CCS. And I'll get to that again in a second. Let me do a couple of things here also. First of all, pointing out that really low-cost coal is one of the drivers for this economy. It helps consumers, it helps industry. A 10% increase, think about this metric, a 10% increase in the cost of electricity, at least according to some economists, will result in a 1% decrease in GDP, and that is 1.5 million job losses. So we've got lots of natural gas, but we also have a circumstance where there's at least a possibility that we're going to lose jobs and we're going to create a lot more cost to the electric system, which will get transferred on to those who consume electricity. The red circles, if you will, in those states, all the green states, majority comes from the generation of coal. But in those states where I misspoke, but in those states that are circled in red, 50% or more of their electricity generation comes from coal. And in those red circled, that electricity is about 9 cents per kilowatt hour, lower than most other places in the country except for the Pacific Northwest that's blessed with a lot of hydropower. Now, not only are we looking at residential costs, but as importantly or more importantly, low-cost power, a lot of it derived from coal, helps us competitively worldwide. This is just a comparison of the costs of coal or electricity generated from coal, industrial and residential in the U.S. versus other European democracies. I don't have to go any farther. You can read the table yourself. One of the reasons why we're competitive is we have very low-cost electricity. A lot of that is coming from coal. As the governor said, we need all of these energy options. The only point I would make is all of these energy options have their own problems and their own challenges. Let me focus on natural gas. If you're in the audience, I'm not picking on you. There's a lot of it. Appreciate all the abundance that you have. It's good for the country. But let me just say, which many of you I know, and that is one of the problems with natural gas, at least in my view, is the volatility of the price compared to the rather constant price of coal. In 2004, gas to produce electricity had doubled in just 2 years to reach $5.50 per MCF. Then it more than doubled again by 2008 to peak at $12.41. By 2012, the price dropped to $2.81 and averaged about $4.44 an MCF in 2013. Another problem with options, Japan being a good example of that. They're entering a second recession. A lot of that, I suspect, is caused by the cost of importing fossil fuels, while more than 48 of their nuclear power plants, or something on that order of magnitude, are currently shut down. But let me focus on Germany in particular and the use of renewables in that country. Wind and solar energy producers in Germany are guaranteed a price usually well above market price, and this electricity is dispatched to the grid before conventional sources. As a result, in Germany, electricity prices have more than doubled and are 40 cents per kilowatt hour compared to the U.S. average of about 10 cents per kilowatt hour. And in Germany, since Fukushima, nuclear has shut down. You all know the problems with getting gas from Russia. Renewables are very costly, and I think this is right. Germany is building 7,000 megawatts of more coal. So, looking at coal, which is the fastest growing resource, energy resource in the world, and the governor pointed this out, real numbers here, 3.6 billion people in the globe have no electricity or very unreliable electricity. Look at China in particular, and that other developing worlds, countries, particularly India. The left-hand chart there is coal consumption, and the right-hand chart are the CO2 emissions as a consequence of that consumption. In 2019, in China and India, coal plants planned or under construction will emit annually as much or more CO2 than the entire U.S. coal fleet currently emits annually. Let me repeat that. This is only CO2 emissions from plants to be built in those two countries over the next half dozen years. By 2040, CO2 emissions from developing countries will equal nearly 70% of the world's total. And this is taking place in a lot of other countries around the world. All of the African continent is going to use coal. India has let it be known very specifically at one of the last climate summits at the UN that they have no intention of doing anything but using more coal. So, everything, the doom and gloom, the Darth Vader part of this presentation, let me just say that it's a complicated situation, okay? We all know about the polar vortex. 60 gigawatts, maybe 100 gigawatts might be retired. That, at least we know, or we think we know, is going to cause huge reliability issues, electric reliability issues in this country. It's already done some in some instances. We have a lot of initiatives going on around renewable energy. You have a lot of that in this state. It creates some amount of market distortions, it seems to me. We have limited future options. I don't know how important this is, but it seems like that's the case, at least in other parts of the world, and we want to be environmental and good environmental stewards. But guess what? The American consumer only thinks about electricity coming out of the outlet. And so this is really more complicated than just thinking about one of these issues at a time, and that's my point there. So how do we get there? It's really a path forward, and as the governor so eloquently noted, relying on American ingenuity and technology, at least in our view, is the way to beat this beast. I would point out to you, this is just a hash chart, and I won't go into it in any detail, but this is something that CURC produced. The points I want to make here is that's about the levelized cost of electricity a couple of years ago. I don't think it's changed all that much. For electricity generated from a supercritical pulverized coal unit without carbon capture, this is the price of electricity from a natural gas unit without carbon capture. That would be less now, given the price of gas. My point is we're not competing against nuclear and wind as a coal industry. We're competing against gas. Asking us to put carbon capture or other emission control systems on new units doesn't make any sense if there's a lot of gas out there, and there is a lot of gas out there, in addition to the fact that much of the economy doesn't require the kind of load growth that we've seen in the past. Now, the opportunity here is to focus on technology. This is the easiest way for me to understand what that means. This is a picture that comes from EPA. It's a map that EPA generates on SO2 emissions, first in 1990, SO2 concentrations. The important piece to understand here is those are the concentrations of SO2 in 1990. The white hash lines are only because there were no monitoring stations at that time. In 2009, that's the picture of concentrations of SO2 in this country. Same metrics, same everything. Now, admittedly, some of that came as a result of good old PRB coal. But a lot now is a consequence of scrubbers. That is technology that we developed, that we have effectively used. Now, that doesn't mean that we ought not to be looking at supercritical and ultra-supercritical units. My only point here is you get greater efficiency from these types of systems, and that's a first and fast look at the type of systems that have been installed. You don't see all of those permitted systems. I don't believe there's one of those permitted systems down there that are an active consideration at the moment. When we think about what we're doing with carbon capture and sequestration, the good news is, now I'm to the good news part, the good news is we're really actually doing a lot of it, with a lot of activity underway, and some of it very positive, as a matter of fact. And those little dots all over the place, this comes out of an MIT survey that they keep looking at this on a yearly basis. Go look at it yourselves. It's a good report, and it's updated monthly. But I could only pick up the U.S. and Europe. There's a lot of activity going on in Asia as well. So I would say that the good news is we're doing things. The bad news is, and I'll get to that in a second, I don't think we're doing it fast enough, and I don't think we have enough resources in order to get it done in time. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Others will probably tell you more about these demonstration projects that the Department of Energy currently has underway. I noticed that Lloyd had in his write-ups for this this presentation, my presentation, the fact that several of these projects are in fact under construction or constructed. That's good news. That's good news. Of the 8 demonstration projects in the United States and the important project SaskPower in Canada, let's just take a look at the SaskPower project, take a look at all of them very quickly. But about $1.3 billion, lots of money, for about 110 megawatt net facility. It was a retrofit. They're taking the CO2 and using it. But if you do the math on all of this, sort of knocking out some of the other costs that are peripheral, it's still about 12,000 per kilowatt versus a couple thousand for natural gas. If you look at Southern Company, and I think of Southern Company like the state of Wyoming. You're doing a lot for coal, taking a lot of enormous leadership here in order to get this done. The project at Kemper, of course, has hit the news on a lot of different occasions. It's no secret that it was estimated to start a cost of about $2.6 billion. It's something north of $5 billion now as of July 2014. And if you do the math there, that's about $11,900 a kilowatt versus a couple thousand, again, for natural gas. And then finally, the NRG plant down in Texas, also a post-combustion retrofit project, about $1 billion ultimately in cost. They're doing something with EOR and using CO2 for that purpose as well. They bought their own oil field because at the time, at a $100 barrel of oil, that made a hell of a lot of sense. Pardon my French. It made a lot of sense. I'm hopeful that they'll weather whatever storm exists here as they go forward. But there are a number of these other projects, 4 of them, Leucadia, Hydrogen Energy, Summit, and FutureGen, that are at least in the bullpen somewhere. Our great hope is that they will go forward, but they're not there yet. The EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, and CURC has done a technology roadmap where we've tried to look at what do we need to do to ensure that technology development stays ahead of when the technology is actually needed in the, we believe, the 2025, 2030 timeframe. This is just a quick look at what we think can be done with technology that is adequately funded and given enough time. The answer is, in both cases, we can hit near zero emissions from coal. We can raise the efficiency of coal conversion systems from the best today, which is 41% to 48%. Keep in mind that each 1% increase in efficiency is about 2.5% decrease in the amount of CO2 emissions. So there is lots of reasons to be perseverant about developing technology itself. One other chart here, this is a polynomial chart, if you will. I learned that word. I don't know what the heck it means, but it means it's a fat chart. There's nothing really specific about it, okay? I got a lot of fudge factors there on both sides of the fat curve. But the point here is that if you look at the top left-hand side, the way we've marked this is that's the cost of, say, a Kemper or a Boundary Dam today with concerted government and public sector effort over an accelerated period of time and with, frankly, lots of money. We can reduce the costs somewhere on the order of 30 to 40% out in the 2025 time frame. And if you put use of CO2 with EOR, there's another 10 to 15% absolute reduction in costs as a consequence of that. So the point here is that in that period of time, we can get down to competing with natural gas as it is today. That's the hopeful part of what I wanted to tell you. But it will take money, it will take time, and it will take commitment in order to achieve that. Some of that we've accomplished. I'm happy to report that while the current administration has not been the most aggressive about funding the R&D pieces of technology development, this year, and I haven't looked at the budget directly, but this year it's a lot better. It's increased, and I would say, because he's here, and I would say this anyway, even if he weren't here, and I actually don't know another Julio Friedman than the one sitting in the room. But Julio is, in my view, very much responsible for better budgets, an enlightened view of what we've got to do with coal, not just from the standpoint that we're going to use a lot of it, but we have the technology to be able to do it. I'd just like to finally point out that we've got a lot of programs that we've developed, a 3-part program that I think is going to work. Senator Heitkamp from your neighboring state is the leader in this effort, and I think in closing that with the new leadership, frankly, in the U.S. Senate, there is an opportunity to do something that we haven't had an opportunity to do in a decade, and that's to put a better light on coal and coal technology. And my plea to you is that we join together in this effort when we have this opportunity, because we're not going to get this done without technology. And if we're going to use coal from the Powder River Basin, I think we have to develop the technology to do it. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attention. Thank you, Lloyd, for letting me speak right after the governor, because everybody is still awake.
Hey, Ben, great job. And I know we have some questions. First, we'll take some questions from the board.
trying to figure out how to ask this succinctly, but you kind of wrapped it up at the end when you were talking about, you know, a vision of the technology investment ultimately leading to a zero emission goal. Have y'all done any work in comparing that, the CO2 capture on natural gas as well, and do kind of a comparison like you did earlier about, you know, here's what the cost is, we're still competing against, you know, a much cheaper natural gas fleet, you know, generated, you know, competitive barrier, if you will. And if we wanted to get more information and drill into this some more, where could we go?
So if I may ask the last question first, and thank you for the question, answer the last question first. Go to www.coal.org. That's our tagline. I don't know how we got that, but we have it. And you can dig into some of that now. There's wonderful amounts of information at DOE and particularly the National Energy Technology Lab website to get information like that. And to answer your question about gas versus coal, we haven't taken a close look at costs with respect to capturing CO2 from gas. Let me start by saying they're going to have to do it too. And they may have to do it in the same time frame, frankly, that we're looking at for coal. What we know about coal is our time frame is 2025, 2030. Why do we say that? That aging fleet that's going to be that old that we pointed out, they're going to retire that stuff. I mean, they're going to keep some of it going perhaps forever, but a lot of it is going to get retired. So we need to be in place with technology that will substitute old existing units for new coal units. Now, we have to be cost competitive with gas. Right now, if gas does not have any of those capture systems on it in that 2025, 2030 time period that I talked about, we think we're as competitive and more so with gas at gas prices that we think will elevate at some point in time in the next 15 years. And even more important, we're looking at systems that capture 90% of the CO2 off of the coal systems, and if gas does nothing, they're at 50%. Now, the expectation, of course, is that we're going to develop the technology for gas as well, and it should be. It should be developed as well. Keep in mind, they have half as much CO2 as coal, and it makes it that much harder and that much more expensive to capture that CO2 molecule out of gas than it does out of coal.
Other questions from the board?
Oh, not you, Don. Come on.
Welcome to Wyoming, Ben.
Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. No, I was just interested on following up that conversation where you're saying natural gas is going to have to face CO2 capture. And we hear certain groups talk about, hey, we've got coal now we're going after natural gas next. Because it's an anti-fossil perspective and policy pursuit, not just an anti-coal and not just a war on coal, but they're taking certain fronts, at different turns, and once they finish one front, then sort of like playing risk, right? Okay, I captured that country, now I'll go capture the next country. When do you see those policy and regulations pushing the CO2 emission regs even lower than what's proposed in Section 111D? And what does that drive us to have to focus on for solutions? Not just 111D, but what's the end game that we really got to fight for?
I don't know in terms of dates, so it's not an area that I'm an expert in at all. I pay some attention to it, of course. I think that the reality of it is, for example, the Coal Utilization Research Council, we have a position, coal producers, utilities, equipment suppliers. That position is we do not believe that we're going to be able to build new coal plants in this country without addressing CO2. When that's the case, I don't know. But that's, quote, the reality that our membership sees in the future as it relates to coal. As it relates to gas, I don't know. I think that it's anyone's guess. We also say, this is not a hedge on our part because of our membership, that we don't take a position on whether you need to address CO2 or greenhouse gases. we take a position that if policy, which is what's going to drive it, whether it's the beyond coal crowd or what, that policy, which may turn towards regulating CO2, what does that mean? That means we need to be ready with the technology. So our position is get the technology ready. Do it as quickly as we can, but the metrics are going to be, it has to be reliable, it has to be affordable, and it has to be available. We need all of those things from a technology perspective, and we need to do it as quickly as we can. And the problem out there, just to say it to every one of you in the room, the problem out there is unless we get buy-in from everybody, that this is something that needs to be done, and it needs to be done as quickly as possible, we will fail.
Other questions?
Just, yeah, I missed your third point. You said reliable, affordable,
Available.
available.
By the way, Mike, I just made that up.
Sometimes brilliance just comes out
Really?
at the
I
funniest
don't think
times.
it was brilliance, but
Yeah.
I was thinking it was alliterative somehow, but I don't think it was even that.
That was great. So Ben, first of all, thanks for taking the time to come out.
Thank you
and-
for letting me be here.
And it's just a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. When you take a look at, even dicing it up, reliable, affordable, and available, what do you think are the three biggest impediments to that?
Misperceptions, meaning that there are too many people who think it can be done real quick, and there are too many people who don't think it can be done at all. Think about that. And those are the way the things have lined up and become the bookends for technology development. The other problem that we've got, I think, is not a commitment, a grand commitment that will be required. The kind of program that we're talking about is about $400 to $500 million a year just for the research and development, and at least $6 billion a year between now and 2025 for large-scale pilots and demonstrations. Now, I didn't talk about how much the government would contribute, how much the private sector would contribute, but that's the order of magnitude of these things. And frankly, when you think about big systems in this country that we've done from a scientific and a technology development perspective, this is nothing. They sound like big numbers. They are big numbers. It's more than I make every year. But it's really minuscule compared to what our country is worth, the importance of all of this, et cetera, et cetera. The last thing of the three is time. We, in my view, are racing against the clock here. And we've let a decade run by without getting a lot done, just to be critical about it. So those are the impediments that I see.
Thank you.
Other questions? Mohammed, if you'll help me out, sir, we have one right here. We're going to take probably 3 questions, and then if anybody else has any, just send those to Holly or myself. We'll forward them to Ben, and he'll respond.
Gene Freeman from the University of Colorado. It seems to me the critical independent variable in all of this is time. What is the average cycle time once you decide to plunk down the $1.5 billion that it takes to build a CCS plant? What's the cycle time to get it built and in operation?
7 years to plan it, 3 years to construct it, something like that. That's been the case with supercritical units, right? I don't see that changing very much. I mean, I think the problem that we have here, too, is we have to do things out of the ordinary. If this is a commitment of the nation, much like putting a man on the moon was done with a lot of money in 10 years, maybe that's how we ought to be thinking about this, because the construction of a demonstration project, and you can talk with, when Carl Moore from Southern comes up here, he can tell you the travails of a company that's done a great job of being the pioneer in all of this, and the costs that they've encountered will come down on the second project, and the time will come down. But let me give you one other metric. Generally, what we find is that the development of large-scale systems or technologies like what we're talking about The gestation period from when it's a twinkle in someone's eye to when it's actually commercially available might be 4 decades.
So the implications of that are that if we don't have at least 20 or 30 starts right now of 20 gigawatts to 40 gigawatts of power, in 20 years, we're going to run into a power shortage.
Conceivable. I think there are others here who can talk more to that particular issue. I would say that from our standpoint, given where the technologies are, we need more than we've got today in terms of demonstrations, replications, and whatnot. But, you know, if we need that many, that's on the basis of coal. I don't know that that's going to happen, frankly.
Well, there needs to be a capacity analysis here
Yes.
somewhere that talks about cycle time.
Yes, I agree with that.
Thank you.
Questions? Got one here? And that'll be our last question.
Bob Ballantyne, Worldwide Liquid in Grand Junction, Colorado. I was just wondering, are you, does any of your discussions include the United Mine Workers?
Yes.
You're, okay.
They actually are a member of CURC.
Okay, so they're in on it. They killed us with the mercury sequestration stuff in '97, so good for you if you have them involved. Thank you.
Well, let's give Ben a hand. Ben, you're a good man.